interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I only have a small speaking part here, but I would like to read my submission, which is only a small one at the end of my presentation, if that was okay.
Yes, whatever suits you, we'll be content with.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Ian Morrison, and my farm Silver Hill is in the Albury district and is bisected by the Tanawa River, a tributary of the Oberhe. I'm here to make sure the many sheep, beef, dry stock farmers on the down and inland hill areas of South Canterbury are represented. What I'm calling for here is equality in regulations. The area is designated high runoff risk phosphorus zone and stretches from the foothills to the coast and was originally deemed an orange zone, but suddenly it is red. There is no scientific evidence that I can find to say that this area is responsible for severe phosphate runoff, and in fact phosphate bonds readily with these clay-based soils. It is medium to low intensively farmed because of climate and no irrigation, and therefore fertiliser use is not high compared to intensive irrigation operations. Most of the farmers in this area don't even realise they are caught up in this particular rule. There is no Dairy New Zealand or Irrigation New Zealand representing them. Large-scale forestry is also not permitted because of moisture retention, rather than sending it down the river for others to use, so our options are limited. The river catchment in my case is above any irrigation takes, and the water quality is very good. Most farmers are embracing good management practice and are very responsible. It is therefore outstanding to me that this area, which is still traditionally farmed as it was 100 years ago when it was first developed, is the subject of the harshest rules in the Canterbury and the whole country regarding areas of winter feed grown. It doesn't make sense to me that this area is not in line with the rest of Canterbury, so I ask you to give this due consideration from an equitable and scientific standpoint and duly delete 14.5 17.7 and replace it with the standard Canterbury-wide rule of 10 hectares for any property less than 100 hectares, 10% of the area for property between 100 and 1,000 hectares, 100 hectares for any property greater than 1,000 hectares, although 10% here would be more sense also. So I'll just read my submission. It's been a while since I put this in. I'm not sure whether I've got all the points from it. So my submission reads, I oppose Plan 7B 14.57 part of property in HHRPZ because it puts an unduly onerous role on a group of dryland farmers, predominantly sheep and beef. The scientific advice of P runoff in the zone is all modelled, and in fact the P levels are very low and show no signs of elevating. Good management practice will be the best avenue to follow and bring it into line with the rest of Canterbury. Up to 15% reduction can be immediately gained through GMP. The reduction of winter feed to 20 hectares in this dryland South Canterbury climate with long winters will not be a mitigation of recent development, but will be a cruel blow to farmers' practices over 100 years old, and still the water from these farms is of very good quality. The fact that under this proposal, if a farm has only a small amount of the phosphate zone on their property, the whole property is captured. This is unfair, has huge economic cost per hectare to low cost, low nutrient input farms in a challenging environment. The average cost per farm for compliance, documentation and monitoring is $14,000 over 10 years, and that is not taking into account the spend on riparian fencing, etc. We don't have many other options for farming on this area, and even forestry is restricted practice because of low flow sensitive rivers. South Canterbury's economy is very reliant on a strong agricultural sector, and analysis of Plan Change 7s for GDP by LWRP makes very sobering reading for this community. The lumping of all the orange zone into the red zone for only practical reasons is a very poor reflection of the work that is supposed to have been done on this plan. Relief sought, remove, not exceed 20 hectares and replace with the current Canterbury-wide 10 hectares for any property less than 100 hectares, 10% of the area for any property between 100 and 1,000 hectares, and 1 hectare is for any property greater than 1,000 hectares. That's all I've got to say. Thanks.
Mr. Morrison, thank you very much for coming in and giving us that introduction and presenting your submission. There may be a question or two for you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Mr. Morrison?
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Morrison. You've referred to Rule 14.5.17, Condition 7. I just wanted to check with you to make sure you understand that's not an absolute limit, that if you don't meet that condition, you just drop down to the next rule, which is a controlled activity consent requirement.
I understand that, Commissioner. I've always, I've found for a long time, when something is put in place that's a rule, that when they're reviewed, they're always stronger the next time. And I don't really think this is necessary to be a condition, you know, put through a consent.
Yeah. Do you have any type of farm environment plan for your property?
I do have some type of plan, yes. Yeah.
Can you recall what sort of plan it is?
It is not an environment plan at this stage, but it is a nutrient budget, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So was that done for you by, who was that done for you by?
It was done for me by myself and the my advisor, who I can't think off the top of my head at the moment.
So did you use beef and lamb template or a deer industry template or anything? Or?
We used a beef and lamb template, yes.
Okay. Do you have any irrigation on your farm?
No, I do not.
And do you winter graze cattle at all?
I do.
How many hectares would you typically have?
For winter grazing cattle?
Yeah, just roughly, doesn't need to be precise.
Probably around 30.
Yep. All right, no, that's all I wanted to clarify with you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming in, Mr. Morrison. We appreciate you taking the opportunity to explain it to us.
Thanks for listening.
Now, next I'm hoping that we can hear from Mr. Hydes.
Commissioner Shepherd, I haven't had Mr. Hydes introduce himself to me. I'm just going to check if he's outside.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Fernanda.
Mr. Hyde's not here.
No appearance?
No.
Well, we'll certainly take into account his submission, and it may be remembered that he also provided a piece of poetry for us, and we'll read that with interest. Now, is Mr. Adams coming? Is Mr. Adams here?
No, that slot was vacated.
That's been vacated?
Yes.
appearance. Then we come to Rooney Farms, I think.
Yes, they're here.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and please introduce yourselves and present as you'd wish. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Kerry Johnston, and to my side here I have Richard Draper from Rooney Farms. So we obviously have both filed a brief of evidence for you. So Mr. Draper will talk to his in the first instance and then answer any questions you may have, and then it will be my turn.
Thank you. Just give me a moment to bring it up on the screen. So Mr. Draper's going first.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Draper, you may read it to us if you wish, but we already have it and we have already read it. So if you prefer just to speak to the main points, well, that's all right too, just as you choose.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, so as Kerry said, I'm Richard Draper. I'm the business manager for Rooney Farms. We're a South Canterbury-based corporate farming business. I think you heard from the managing director yesterday on other matters and that affect
We did.
different company. So our submission concerns four main areas within the plan or the proposed plan that affect our farming business. The first is the impact of the Orari River's high naturalness water body classification and how that impacts on a resource consent that we're having trouble renewing at the moment. The second submission point is on the Orari River flow and allocation regime. I want to comment a little bit on land use restrictions in the high runoff risk phosphorus zone, as we heard from the previous submitter, similar impact on our farming business. And also finally just touch on the Rangitata Auden high nitrogen concentration area and just pass a couple of comments on that. So I'm conscious that we won't take up any more time than we need, but
No, we've got the time to hear all that you want to tell us.
thank you, appreciate that.
It's an important submission and we want to know all about it.
Thank you. So we have on one of our high country properties in the upper Orari catchment taken use consent for irrigation. The farm's a relatively large high country station, but like a lot of high country stations has a very small amount of actual productive area, mainly on the lowland river flats and some lower rolling downlands. And so we've invested pretty heavily on improving the production and financial viability of that station. I've been with the company for 8 years. The property itself was bought by Gary in 2009 in really an economically unviable state, but our passion is high country farming and also protecting the natural environment, but we're also conscious that long-term protection of the natural environment involves economic viability. And so we've put some capital in and some resources in, and we've got ourselves a productive farm system and an economically viable entity. The consent, so we've put in 90 hectares of irrigation, which is a major driver of our farm system. The consent for that activity is currently with ECAN. We're seeking renewal on that, and we're really having a lot of trouble, which Kerry's going to go into a lot more detail on how the rule framework or the current rule framework is impacting our ability to renew that consent. It was something that was picked up through the ZIP process, the sub-regional process, and some tensions there, recognising that landowners should be recognised for the investments they've made in existing infrastructure, and there's a policy in the ZIP addendum about how that could be recognised and allowing those investments to be allow renewal of people who've made existing investments in the likes of the consent I'm talking about. So at the moment we've made approximately $1.5 million worth of investments in just that and related. So when I say related, I mean when you put in irrigation infrastructure, you often regrass and you increase your soil fertility as well, and you have to re-fence. So that's our estimate of the amount of capital we've employed. The economics of the farm are heavily leveraged against that investment, and just for a point of reference, it came up in our operations meeting this morning. We're currently looking for a new member of staff to shift that irrigation for summer, and the question was asked of me, well, what happens if we can't renew this consent in the future? And I thought it was really pertinent to bring that point up because it came through this morning. So the answer is we're going to drop from 3 labour units this summer, and it'll be 2. And so, you know, in an economic scenario that we're in at the moment, that's the last thing we want to be doing. We want to be supporting employment, but nonetheless, you know, farms have to be viable. So, second submission point. I was heartened throughout this process to read how much weight, you know, everyone values the natural values around the Orari Gorge, and that's something we generally agree with. I think it's an idiosyncrasy associated with the current flow and allocation regime that all of the takes are measured at the very bottom of the Orari system, and that is a bit of a challenge for me because there's not a great correlation between upper and lower stretches of that river, and there's lots of dry reaches and well-established movement of water between river catchments. So our current consent is measured at effectively a flow recorder in the gorge, and I'm suggesting that that's a really good place for it to stay if we're serious about protecting the values in the gorge. It would make sense to recognise that. I want to endorse Mr. Morrison's comments about it's also seemed to us we're cognizant of the fact that soil loss contributes to phosphorus loss and other things, and you know I think there's a really significant awareness that's spread through farming in terms of good winter grazing practices and how to minimise that. The challenge I have is that this sub-regional section is the first sub-regional section, I think, to decide to tighten the screws tighter than Plan Change 5, which hasn't actually been let to come through and see the results of. And you know, will be impacted quite significantly by the winter grazing rules. And I take the Commissioner's earlier point that maybe that means just a controlled, although I read it as restricted discretionary rule that we would end up triggering on most of our farmers due to the grazing area, winter grazing area. And every time one goes through one of those processes, we end up spending money on things that take us away from where we want to be, and we're pretty focused on outcomes. And I think farm environmental plans are good because they focus you on what you're doing for your farm and achieving those outcomes. We've got a big planting program going at the moment, significant fencing program. And every time I see the audit pathway, you know, a member of our team spends significant amounts of time collating information, and I'm just concerned that as an industry we're becoming more focused on administration and collecting the information to satisfy the auditor and get the audit result than actually going back to that lower threshold where the farm environmental plan is written about the outcomes. These are the fences I want to put in and I've got 3 years to do them. This is the planting, this is the major loss of sediment through my river. Can I put a trap or a tension bund or something that's sensible? Because in my view, environmental sustainability is very similar to health and safety. It starts with the top 2 inches. It's where is the focus, what are we thinking about? If we're focused about satisfying an audit, it takes something away, and I think what we heard from the previous submitter was, you know, these things are not getting any easier. So, and final point regarding the Rangitata Orton nitrogen concentration area, there's been lots of submissions on this, and so I would just pass a couple of comments. The first being that the most recent data out of ECAN that I've seen suggests that the trend for much of that area is actually heading in the right direction, which I know that's not consistent with what people think happens with irrigation, but there's a number of reasons that factor into that. And so if we're being scientific and we're looking at the evidence, the trend is not all bad, certainly for the whole of that area. And so then when we're writing rules and restrictions that impact on people's financial viability, and therefore, social health and well-being, I just request that as much time and as much leniency, and if possible, tying the reductions to the actual evidence. So if things continue to improve, my understanding of the higher order documents is that those restrictions won't be required, but once they're written in a plan as a hard and fast rule, that's the way they'll be interpreted. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, that's splendid. Thank you, Mr. Draper. You've managed to collect together your main points and explain them in a way we can easily understand, and I congratulate you on that. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Mr. Draper?
Yeah, thank you. Not so much a question, but just to let you know that the issue of the high naturalness water bodies and renewal of existing consents is an issue that's very much before us. There's a number of submitters have raised that, and the staff, in response to questions that we've asked, the staff have prepared written answers to our written questions, and there's a second suite of answers to our questions that's now on the ECAN webpage. And as part of that, they've developed a rule, they've called it 14.5.6a, a restricted discretionary activity rule. It's on page 6 of 11 of that second set of answers, and that's a rule that will deal with this issue of these renewing these consents. Now, that doesn't mean that rule is going to end up in the plan, it's just been put forward for us to consider as an option. So it's very much an issue that we'll be dealing with as we proceed. But I just wanted to let you know that the staff have done some work on that already.
So thank you for that.
And to the Section 42A team, the issue that Mr. Draper raises at is 5.7 and 5.8 regarding the potential for a separate allocation block above the Orari gorge. I thought there was an interesting points being made in the evidence. So if you could address that in reply and just have the appropriate technical staff look at the merits of that for us, and then come back to us and advise us accordingly. So what that means is I think you've raised something interesting, and we're just going to ask the staff to look at it from a technical perspective when they come back to us at the end of the hearing.
Thank you.
Yep. But no actual questions from your evidence, thanks.
Now, Mr. Draper, you have the good fortune to be advised by Ms. Johnson on a different kind of technicality, the technicality of resource management rules. Is that right? You get advice from her?
Yes, yeah, Kerry's our RMA and planning expert.
Yes. Well, I'm sure then she will have explained to you that the question of water consents expiring and applying for a replacement consent is not a process on which you can have an assurance in advance that you'll get the replacement consent on the same terms as you had previously, because the whole purpose of it being required that these consents are for term is so that when the time comes of expiry and considering a replacement, it needs to be looked at, and this is what the law says, it needs to be looked at in the conditions that exist at the time that the replacement is being considered, so that the regional plan isn't able to give you an assurance that you'll necessarily get it on the same terms.
Yeah.
Have you had that advice?
So I guess from our company's perspective, the consent maybe doesn't need to be on exactly the same terms, and that things move on, including minimum flows and allocation blocks and that sort of stuff, as we've found with other consents. But a pathway to renew the consent would be a good start. A viable pathway to. I'm not a legal mind at all, but it'd be nice if there was some weight given, I think, in the RMA to the investments that people have made and how that comes through. Yeah.
Of course, and that's always presented, and it's always a relevant issue, but you don't necessarily get full return for it, because it all depends on the whole circumstances that need to be considered at the time. But it's already there in the Resource Management Act, and I've no doubt it'll be there when that's replaced, that the investments that have been made are taken into account. Now, Ms Johnson, you're going to give us a statement next, is that right?
Yes, but obviously in light of what Commissioner Van Voorthuizen has advised in relation to the new rule that is proposed, obviously my evidence was specific to that sort of consenting pathway to be able to renew these water rights from a high naturalness water body. So I'm happy to just take questions actually if you have any from me at this point in time.
Well, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Ms Johnson on this occasion?
No questions, but just to clarify that that rule hasn't yet been proposed by the officers, it's just wording put forward for our consideration.
Yes, and that's an important point to note, because as I have explained in my evidence, the pathway does exist at the moment, there's no doubt about that, but it is proving to be quite a fraught pathway, particularly for renewals. And so really it is about making sure that the rule, and that there's actually a suitable policy, because it's actually the policy that's causing the issues or the tensions in regards to this renewal, are both adequate in order for there to be a less fraught pathway through this. Obviously, taking your board, Commissioner Shepherd, we know that we're not expecting things to be renewed under the same terms, for example, and that obviously it's still got to be considered on its own merits. It's just to not have the issues that we're presently having in regards to renewal of these water rights.
Yep, no, I understand.
Well, thank you, Ms Johnson, and we're of course glad to see that you're having the opportunity to give advice to Rooney Farms so that they're being steered in the right direction. Thank you both for coming in this afternoon. We're grateful for your informative presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners.
I think I get to stay put.
Well, while you're there in your seat, Ms Johnson, I'll just bring up the submission of Orari Water Users Group. That's the next one, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Now, we have the submission from the Orari Water Users Group in the name of Mr Mulligan. Is that Mr Mulligan beside Ms Johnson?
It is Mr Mulligan beside Ms Johnston. Yeah.
Oh, greetings and welcome, Mr Mulligan. Thank you for coming in. We have already read the submission, and so the opportunity is for you to present it to us and say what you would like to add to the submission. And you may start with that just as you choose.
Well, thank you very much. Kerry's going to talk to the submission per se, because I'm afraid I don't have the skill set. But I am Mark Mulligan, as you've mentioned. I farm in the Orari catchment. Along with some other farmers in the catchment, we formed a group to advocate for people that use water from that catchment for agriculture, and to engage with other interested parties and try and find a way forward with a sustainable plan for the river. Some key points in 2011-2012, we got our group together and formed our incorporated society and joined with some other interested parties in the Orari catchment in a steering group that was facilitated by ECAN at the time, and we were encouraged to do this and to get everyone in the community with interest on board, which we duly did. And over a period of maybe 2 years, we heard a lot of technical evidence and covered ecological, hydrological and financial implications of the flow and allocation regime that we're all trying to agree on. And that's for the tributaries as well as the Orari. And from that, a new regime was put in place and went to the Land and Water Regional Plan. And when Plan Change 7 process was started, we were assured by the Zone Committee that the Orari would not be revisited as such. On Plan Change 7 being notified, we were surprised to be told that changes had been made with no consultation or understanding of the work already undertaken. These changes would appear to have had an adverse effect on the allocation regime in particular. So I guess what I'm saying is I felt as though we had put a lot of work into this across all of the groups that were interested. We thought that it would be in place with Plan Change 7, but it would appear, or I'm advised, that the allocation was different, and this was not in our best interests. But from that moment, I have to defer to Kerry on the technical stuff, I will say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mulligan. That's an introduction. And perhaps if we go straight to Ms. Johnson and hear what she has to say, and then if we have any questions we can ask, and you can both of them answer.
Yes, so in essence, as you know from my evidence, the focus is on the changes to the allocation limits that have been proposed in table 14H of Plan Change 7. And it's just to reinforce what Mr. Mulligan has said, is that the process that was gone through sort of back between sort of 2010 and 2014 obviously used a particular method to derive the allocation limits. That method has obviously subsequently changed, and therefore to take the crude approach that was taken, which was just to adjust the allocation in the limit plan by subtracting the Upper Coopers Creek allocation, actually is not correct, and it also actually creates sort of a level of potentially now more so for over allocation that didn't exist before, because when you look in my evidence, obviously the allocation is significantly more using ECAN's current numbers than what is in the plan. And so that allocation limit had been set on the basis that the current allocation would reflect exactly that, the current allocation at that time, and then there was a sinking lid obviously from that point. So we really are seeking to revisit that allocation limit that has been proposed using, and update it. It makes sense to update it using ECAN's new methodology, but that it's done consistently with that methodology rather than just as a bit of a hack, to excuse the expression. Yeah.
I'm just making a note of that. Look, consistently. That's the point that you're making.
Yes.
Anything further you want to say at the moment?
No, I think the one other key point that I must add, and it is in my evidence, is that The allocation limits, when these were set, did include the Timaru District Council consents, which were for community supply. And obviously, subsequently to that, TDC has gone through its own consent process, and one of those consents has obviously been increased quite dramatically from what it was previously. And again, that hasn't actually been taken into account in the revision of the number by ECAN at this point. But it obviously, to be consistent with methodology that we're seeing elsewhere in the setting of allocation limits, it actually also now makes sense to remove those Timaru District Council consents from the allocation. So I'm obviously happy to take questions.
So, doing that, separating out the TDC network, that would be consistent as well with the new NPSFM, wouldn't it, and the obligatory priorities?
Correct, yes.
Because they will argue, and it may be arguable, but they will argue that they come into priority 2, and the rest are priority 3.
Yes.
And when finally we get down to the detail of giving effect to the NPSFM 20, that will have to be given full attention to, won't it?
It will, yes. And like I said, it is now consistent with how ECAN has treated the allocation limits across the rest of Plan Change 7, as you'll be aware from my other brief of evidences on allocation. So
Yes.
it does make sense that we do implement that change at this point in time. But I agree with you, Commissioner Shepherd. It obviously recognises the priority of the community supply takes. Yeah.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions for either of these representatives?
No questions, but I'm sure that the officers in reply will revisit the allocation limit for the A permits in Table 14H in light of the evidence that you've provided. So,
That would be very good, thank you.
and are nodding their heads. So I'm sure this will be brought to our attention. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in and for your preparation. Now, Ms. Fernando, which is the next submitter for this afternoon?
And that was the last submitter for this afternoon.
Oh, we've run through the day, have we?
Yes.
All right. Well, then we'll adjourn until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, when we'll proceed with, is it Rangitata Dairies?
Biggs Agriculture first tomorrow morning.
Oh, Big Jack. All right, we'll adjourn accordingly. Thank you, everyone.